Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. In one of his last official acts before vacating the office he held since spring of 2020, Defense Minister Benny Gantz went out of his way to praise Egypt as Israel's peaceful neighbor and strategic partner. Gantz reacted furiously to a statement by a junior but crucial member of Benjamin Netanyahu's emerging coalition, who insisted Egypt is an enemy of the Jewish state. What are the true dimensions of the Israeli-Egyptian relations, and should Cairo be concerned as it watches the Jerusalem political drama unfold? To discuss it, we're joined from Central Israel by Colonel in Reserve Reuven Ben-Shalom, who is a TV7 Powers and Play panelist, cross-cultural strategist, and associate at the ICT at Reichman University. Thank you for joining us, Colonel.
Thank you.
Also joining us from the Jerusalem area is Dr. Ofir, who is a senior researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University. Thank you for joining us as well, sir.
Thank you very much.
And with me here in the studio is our TV7 editor-at-large and host of Watchmen Talk, Powers and Play, and so much more, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, I'd like to ask you to give us a broader understanding of the current composition of this dynamic relationship between Israel and Egypt.
Well, in the Middle East, words carry a lot of weight. And even press reports, let alone when politicians and future ministers, or in this case, deputy ministers, speak, there are repercussions. Every time there are magazine articles or television stories about massacres in Israel's history, for instance, when Egyptian prisoners of war were killed by their Israeli captors. There is a diplomatic problem between the governments, even though it deals with ancient history in current terms. So this time around, a junior politician, but nevertheless someone future Prime Minister Netanyahu probably needs for his coalition, remarked that a memorial to Egyptian commando fighters who were sent to Jordan in order to fight in the 67 war and were then killed in fighting, that it is not appropriate for Israel to set up this memorial for enemies, even though Israel and Egypt for the last 40 years have peaceful relations. Apparently, Defense Minister Gantz understood that this could cause a storm in Egyptian public opinion, and we know that beside the very, very good relationship between the governments, which we will go about, there is still some cold peace between the peoples. And therefore, Gantz made sure that he came out with a statement regarding the relationship between the governments, and especially under President Sisi, who is doing a lot for regional security and for the relationship between Egypt and Israel.
Indeed, one of the significant contributions, if I may, to the Egyptian role in Israel is also specifically, and we need to say that, the Gaza Strip. Egypt has a lot of sway over the Islamist Hamas organization, and anything that happens in the Palestinian enclave, because, of course, of the fact that it also borders this territorial enclave, and also has its own interest to maintain stability in that region, considering the fact that it is adjacent to quite the lawless area with multiple organizations that aspire to destabilize Cairo proper. And I'd like to start with you, Dr. Winter, if I may. To what degree would you regard the Cairo-Jerusalem relationship as one that holds in the long run?
Yeah, we're almost celebrating 44 years to the peace relations between Israel and Egypt. And this is a very stable peace, though, as you mentioned before, it's still coined a cold peace. But the relations are very good, very close in the formal level, very good security cooperation, especially during Sisi term, against mutual threats of terrorism. in the Sinai Peninsula. Israel and Egypt, of course, most of it is under the table. We don't hear a lot about it, but there is a lot of trust between the military establishments in both sides, and very good dialogue between the leaders, the prime ministers, and President Sisi. And more than that, we have also very good relations, economic relations, especially in the field of energy. And I speak about the long-term deal of exporting Israeli gas to Egypt. It started in 2020. It's a deal for 10 years, $15 billion. It's very significant for both countries and also for Egypt's aspirations to become an energy hub for its neighbors.
Indeed, and not only that, of course, on top of that, there is the trilateral MOU that was signed between the European Union, Egypt, and Israel, where Israel transfers gas to Egypt, and from Egypt, then it is transformed into LNG, the liquid natural gas, and then shipped into the European Union. So there are also foreign interests into this relationship functioning. And Colonel Ben-Shalom, I'd like to ask your perspective to this, because Egypt was one of the most vigorous enemies of the Jewish state years ago, of course, almost 44 years since we did establish peaceful relations with Israel's western neighbor. But it seems, as both Dr. Winter and Mr. Oren have mentioned, the publics do not necessarily know each other. As a cross-cultural strategist, what is the key challenge to the cold relations between the two peoples, even though they're so significant, strategically integrated, also vis-a-vis the United States, for instance?
I think this is probably the most interesting part of all of this, because there is great animosity in the Egyptian street. You see the professional unions in Egypt. By the way, I learn a lot from this by reading what Dr. Winter writes. And to see the undercurrents in Egypt, one would think that we could transcend this, and knowing all the interests, and after decades of peace, what's the problem between the peoples? We even see that sometimes, looking in the past, like the Oslo Agreement with the Palestinians. I almost feel like the Palestinians could have flipped overnight as far as their perspective to Israel, but not the Egyptians. Like there's something ingrained there that won't go away. But this has to do, with the Egyptian society, the Muslim Brotherhood, some deep sentiments and fear, at least the narratives that they portray it, as if Israel, is out to threaten their way of life and overtake them and things like that. I think this is something that will take time, since we already said that there's so many economic interests and security interests, the Gaza Strip and energy and water desalination, and there's so much to gain, which is why we're doing all this work. I think eventually, and I hope that processes like this will also change the hearts and minds. On the military side, when I see engagements, the very few engagements I had with the Egyptian officers, of course, it's warm, it's brotherhood, okay? Understanding that we're neighbors, seeing eye to eye. Even the issue that we just discussed now, we can get into that later, about this memorial site. It has to do with respect and with honor, because we are no longer enemies.
Mr. Oren?
Well, when the State of Israel was set up in 1948, and obviously before that, Jews in Palestine, in British Mandatory Palestine, roamed freely around the area. The feeling was that the Egyptians are a bit different than from other Arabs. They are not as Arabic, even in their heritage, as Syrians, Jordanians, Iraqis, and the like. And in their national character, they were more patient. They did not look at Israelis so vehemently and so vindictively. This may have changed because Israel and Egypt fought 4 or 5 wars, and there are hard feelings, families of those of the fallen. And if you look at the change, in the mid-1950s, Israel wanted and acted to depose Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian president who who would be the leader of the entire Arab world and wanted to destroy Israel. Fast forward 30 years later, Israel, of course, is very sorry when Sadat is assassinated, and Israel warns Hosni Mubarak when there are plots against him. And right now, Israel has such a stake in the longevity of the Sisi regime that President Sisi knows that if Israeli intelligence gets word of a plot against him, he will be told about it. Because one of Israel's closest confidants in the Egyptian government is Intelligence Minister Abbas Kamel, and there is cooperation and collaboration between Israeli military intelligence, Shabak, Mossad, and the Egyptian Mukhabarat because of what was mentioned earlier, the mutual threats, the common enemies.
Indeed, and the first time, of course, just recently, in recent years, to be exact, that the intelligence cooperation, not only with Egypt, but the triangle of Egypt, Israel, and Jordan was highlighted by, of course, at the time, Deputy Chief of General Staff Yair Golan, who, of course, you just interviewed, and it was a fascinating. Encourage our viewers at home to watch Watchmen talk.
By the way, when Egypt looks at its strategic horizon, it borders Libya, it borders Sudan, it borders Gaza, and the only safe border it has is with Israel.
Indeed. Dr. Winter, I'd like to ask you, during the first years of the Sisi government in Cairo, of course, under the Obama administration, it was somewhat alienated, and it was time and again rebuked for human rights abuses and all kind of quite problematic terms were used within the context of Middle Eastern culture, hence bringing about the famous statement by Sameh Shoukry, the foreign minister in Egypt, who was serving also back then, who said that they're going to put the eggs in different baskets, diverted subsequently also attention more to relations with Moscow, with Beijing, among others. And we could see that under the Biden administration, which is just pretty much the same actors within that administration that were dealing with Egypt also back then, it seemed like they were more careful this time around. With Egypt, Israel was, of course, repeatedly trying to bolster relations between the two sides, and it seemed that the Egyptian involvement during the last operation in Gaza has raised Egypt's status in Washington to a new high. Is that something that is regarded in Egypt as somewhat of a strategic foundation to relations with the Jewish state at this point?
Definitely, you are totally right. By the way, the first phone call that Sisi got from President Biden was following his mediation between Israel and Hamas back into 2021. So indeed, I think for Egypt, this is one of its strategic maybe roles in the Middle East to mediate between Israel and Hamas. It brings stability to the region. It makes more security, fighting terrorism, and also enabling Hamas and Israel to finish their conflicts more quickly and preserve the ceasefire. So for Egypt, this is one of it's a way to position itself better in Washington. Definitely, you are right that following the Arab Spring, there was a lot of criticism in Egypt against the Obama administration for supporting allegedly the Muslim Brotherhood. But yet, I think that the United States is still the most important ally of Egypt when it needs some financial support by the IMF or other funds. Of course, there is an annual aid, American aid to Egypt, that is very important for its economic and military functioning. So it's very important for Egypt to preserve its role in the United States. And Israel is a way to do it. Also, by the way, fostering openness towards Judaism in Egypt, maybe even renovation of some synagogues and cemeteries that we saw during the last years. It's also a way to getting closer to the Jewish lobby and its alleged influence in the American capital.
Indeed. Colonel, I'd like to refer the next question to you. When we're looking at, specifically, we spoke already about the energy, but there is quite the unique relationship between Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, Israel, the United Arab Emirates. We saw this going as far as influencing the situation in Libya, for instance, when we saw the Tripoli government fight against Haftar in the east, which was backed, of course, by the mentioned group. Of course, the Russian involvement there has drawn the Americans to the Turkish side, but of course, since then, many developments occurred. Turkey is now trying to improve its relations also with Egypt after the meeting at the football field in Qatar between Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. We saw the statement coming out by President Sisi, and much of this, from what at least I hear behind the scenes, has also to do with Israeli involvement, trying to mediate to a certain degree, albeit a secondary role, but still quite a significant one. To what degree are we seeing the various shifts on the geopolitical field trigger deeper cooperation between the two countries at a time when, of course, we are about to have a new government here in Jerusalem with members of government who are going to be problematic also in the eyes of Cairo, and this might, of course, trigger crises which we are yet to know to what degree are they going to harm these relations.
Well, it's interesting. I think many times as Israelis, we look around us and we speak of the instability of others and regimes rising and falling, when we ourselves, even as a democracy, we're very, very dynamic. Look what's happening in this change of government right now. And certainly this impacts Israel and the region. Israel's policies will change. Some say that there's concern in the region. Some say there's fear in the region. That's interesting in itself. Now, what's interesting to me looking in the Middle East is how dynamic things are. One might think that we are long-time nations with clear strategic long-term objectives. Why would things be so dynamic? Is it just like the war between Russia and Ukraine? No, it's more than that. It's that countries continuously calculate their interests, realign themselves. There's different concerns at different times, but also a different understanding of how the world works. I see more alliances, more cooperations. It goes, by the way, from the United States. The superpower of the world now understands it can never act alone. It needs coalition, it needs support, it needs back channels. So you see how people are always realigning themselves and calculating what to do. Even us in Israeli eyes, we're used to looking at things of black and white, good and bad. And Qatar, for instance, and the place that Qatar plays, a few years ago, we would speak to them as sponsors of Hamas, like Qatar, the bad guys. Suddenly, they're aligned with Egypt. You see the warming of relations there. No longer Egypt and Qatar competing on who is the custodian of the Gaza Strip, but in a way working together, right? I think it's interesting for us to see how we play into this. And since the real trends are positive, because really, look at this, on the ground, most of us want the same thing, from UAE, right, to Egypt, regional players that you also mentioned, Turkey, huge shift in their interests and the way they're aligning with us. Right now, to me, this seems like a positive trend of all working together, when still we can't forget that the negative elements are there. Hamas are not going to shift, Iran is not going to shift, and a lot of what we're talking about now is how these entities are aligning themselves to counter the Iranian threat, and that is not going anywhere because they do have a long strategic goal, which for us is very negative.
Mr. Owen?
Egypt, under President Sadat, when it moved into the American orbit, also changed its relationship vis-a-vis Iran. And in 1980, when the Americans wanted to release the hostages in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, they took off from Ras Banas, from Egypt. And the realignment that Reuven Ben-Shalom just spoke about also has to do with Israel being moved from EUCOM to CENTCOM. Now that Israel and Egypt are under the same area of responsibility in the U.S. Command delineation, it makes for better cooperation between Americans, Jordanians, Israelis, Egyptians in the Red Sea and in the various choke points. The Suez Canal, of course, when people talk about supply chain problems, just imagine what could happen if terrorists or other malignant actors got their hands on various posts along the route from the Far East through Bab el-Mandeb. We have the problems in Yemen with the Houthis at Hodeidah airport and other places. So the Egyptian-Israeli-American cooperation is the basis, and you can add the Jordanians to it, is the basis for regional security in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Red Sea.
And not only military security or defense security, but also food security. When we're talking about energy security, food security, we see the tripartite meetings between Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq. They have quite the unique relationship there. But Dr. Winter, Egypt is not only concerned by the Middle East heading eastward, but also it is a North African state. Ultimately, it has its own considerations vis-a-vis Sudan, vis-a-vis Ethiopia in particular, with the whole situation with the dam and everything that has to do with that. To what degree is the Egyptian angle here aligned with that of Israel, considering Israel's own strategic interests vis-a-vis Ethiopia, and also its unique relationship that obviously, with much of Egypt's health or help at the time, provided for the new unique normalization, if you will, even though it is, of course, always in question, with the North Sudanese.
Yes, when we speak about Ethiopia, it's interesting. We spoke about the ambivalence in the Egyptian position towards Israel, which is part of the cold peace. We see sometimes, some conspiracies in the Egyptian media, according to which Israel supports Ethiopia against Egypt and may harm Egyptian rights in its water from the Nile. At the same time, we know there were some publications that Egyptians officials approached their Israeli counterparts and asked for an Israeli mediation with Ethiopia. Israel so far refrained from being involved in this conflict. The United States failed, so why should we think that Israel could succeed where United States failed? Yet Egypt believes in diplomacy, and following the last Sharm el-Sheikh climate change conference, there are some hopes for resuming the talks between Cairo and Addis Ababa on this regard. Of course, Egypt and Israel may cooperate in many fields like food security, water security, not only energy. When we speak about environmental issues, there are Israeli technologies, Israeli knowledge. We share the same space. So there is a lot of potential for much more collaborations between both sides, which still are not exhausted to their potential.
Indeed, and of course, in the State of the Union of Ursula von der Leyen earlier this year, we heard her speak about substantive investment in various types of farms, especially solar farms, to be implemented on Egyptian soil, something that we are expected to see with roughly €1 trillion budget, which is going to be quite substantive. Colonel Ben-Shalom, I'd like to hear more of the military angle, considering we don't have very much time left. Of course, Egypt has been battling Wilayat Sina, or at least the remnants thereof, the Islamic State, and which technically is one angle of several tribes that have differentiated themselves from the Muslim Brotherhood or Ansar Bet al-Maqdis, what it used to be called, which seems to change its name every several years in such a cycle. Is Israel, of course, according to various reports, which indicates that we are involved, at least actively involved in aerial operations with Egyptians, is Israel being very cautious in its approach there, considering the fact that, of course, the relations or the dynamic there is very critical also from a defensive perspective from Israeli national defense?
Well, first, internally for Egypt, I think they calculated as a historic mistake, maybe, leaving the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years in this undergoverned state and enabling, actually, ISIS and these terror elements to flourish, has to do with these sentiments of the Bedouin tribes, etc. And now I think we see a strategic shift as far as the policy in Egypt, huge investments, countering terrorism. So certainly we see that effort there. For Israel, of course, it's a great interest. And the only way we know to counter terrorism in these are collaborations, because the terrorists collaborate effectively, cross-border, excellent communication. They throw away past animosities and do a great job to work together. And we sometimes, democracies and partners, have a hard time to cooperate. So I think this is changing. We can shorten this discussion because most of these things are under the radar screen, but they're excellent relations. I know Israel invests great resources and efforts in order to assist the Egyptians to know what's going on, to thwart attacks and help Egypt stabilize the Sinai Peninsula in general, and especially next to the border and what has to do with the Gaza Strip.
Just one line regarding what you said about eggs and baskets. Camels don't lay eggs.
Indeed. Well, that is a fact, biologically speaking, but maybe woke societies might beg to differ. This is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Dr. Winter, Colonel Ben-Shalom, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's panel. I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.